1995, together with Ernesto Laclau, is a touchstone of left-wing philosophy, and it had a huge impact on me when I was a political science student, actually. Her new book is On Left Populism, and it came out in Swedish earlier this year. And if anyone wants to read a book that's been on the night tables of left-wing politicians like Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Jeremy Corbyn, you should pick it up after the talk. And Chantal has even agreed to sign it for you. So, unfortunately, you have a sore throat, but sorry for that on behalf of Sweden. But we'll carry on anyhow, I think. So, welcome to Sweden. What was the purpose of writing this book?
Okay, well, first, good evening to everybody, and I apologize for my voice. It's Extinction Rebellion, but Extinction Rebellion in a very particular type of mind. But apparently the Swedish weather has not been very kind to me. I remember Leonidas say, well, you know, it's not good for philosophers, Swedish weather, because Descartes came here and he died.
Yes, sorry for reminding you of that, sorry.
So, you know, I hope the same is not going to happen.
I asked if I should do that joke on the stage, and everyone said, no, don't.
Well, okay. So let me just briefly say a few words about my book, For a Left Populism. I must specify this is a political intervention. That book is not a book in which, you know, I try to define what is populism, and it's not something that's got to do with sociology, but it is really a political intervention. My books are always, in a sense, political intervention, because I'm always think on the. It's always a combination between politics and theory, but this one is mainly driven by a sense of urgency that I feel. Because I think that we are living in a conjuncture in Western Europe. I also insist that my book is a reflection on the conjuncture in Western Europe, which is open to serious danger, but also to serious opportunities. And I also want to insist that for the left it's very important to understand that, and to understand the opportunity that they need to seize. Because with this conjuncture, I would qualify it as being a crisis of neoliberal hegemony. It takes different form in different country, but this is definitely the case. And in reaction to that, what we are living is what I call in the book a populist moment. Populist movement is characterized by a series of resistances against the post-democratic situation. That is what we are living today in Western Europe, and which is a consequence precisely of 30 years of neoliberal hegemony. And many of those are resistances against what I call the post-democracy, which has been installed by neoliberal hegemony. Well, by post-democracy, and here I refer to some work that I've been doing before, particularly, for instance, with a book called On the Political, which has also been published by Tanker Kraft here in Sweden. And I think this, what I call post-democracy, has got two aspects. The first one, I call post-politics. That's exactly what I have studied in the book On the Political. And basically, by that, I understand the fact that in the last 30 years, because of the move toward the center of social democratic parties, we have been living in a situation in which when citizens were going to vote, they did not really have a choice, because there was really not much difference between the politics of the center right and the center left. And of course, this is linked to the fact that social democratic parties finally, well, I think, would capitulated to neoliberalism. It took differences. For instance, this capitulation came later in Sweden than, for instance, in Britain, because in Britain, of course, with Tony Blair, the third way, this is the moment when it, but basically it consists the acceptance by social democratic parties, but the acceptance that they believed that there was no alternative to neoliberal globalization. So they accepted Margaret Thatcher's verdict, that there is no alternative. This is why she was called Tina, by the way. Okay, so if there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization, it means, of course, that social democratic parties, they can't really offer a different program. And basically what has happened with, after what I call post-politics, is a situation in which basically social democratic parties were accepting the terrain of neoliberal hegemony, but proposing we are going to manage it a bit more humanely, a bit more redistribution, okay? But the point is that I insist on that the citizen did not have any possibility of a choice. Political issue became pure technical issue. There was no real decision. And of course, if this is the case, they are much better dealt with by experts. You know? So there is for instance, I think it's interesting to refer here to a motto of the Indignados in Spain that you say, we've got a voice, tenemos voto, you say, but a vote, but no tenemos voice, no tenemos voto, pero no tenemos voz. No, so we can vote, but you know it does not make any difference or consequence. And I think that this consequence of that is that one of the main ideas of what democracy is about, which is popular sovereignty, been eliminated of the vocabulary, you know, of the left certainly. And this is something that I already studied in previous book. What is new, and this is the second component of the post-democratic situation, is that next to that, you know, and here I'm thinking more of what's happening at the economic level, because post-politics, of course, is economics, but it's more the consequence of politics. We have been living, particularly since the 1928 crisis, with the politics of austerity, what I call a process of oligarchization of our societies. The fact that, and this is something which is very well shown in the book by Thomas Piketty, not his more recent one, well, of course, the recent, we follow that basis, but the one, Capitalism in the 21st century, where it showed that in our societies today we are faced with a real gulf between a small group of people who are getting richer and richer, and the rest which are being pauperized, precarized, and of course, obviously it has touched more particularly the popular sector, but also the middle class. Some people are thinking that the disappearance of the middle class, they are really becoming pauperized and privatized, precarized, sorry. So the conjunction of those two elements is what I call post-democracy. On one side, abandon of the idea of popular sovereignty, consequence of post-politics, and on the other side, abandon of the very idea of equality, which of course is linked to the fact that no inequalities are accepted, and that people say, well, you know, that's a fault, there is no way we can do about that. Well, what is interesting, and that is something that we can locate to 2011, so in the last 10 years, we have been seeing a series of resistance, movement of resistance against this post-democracy. The protest movement, the movement of the populist movement. And of course, usually it's presented, you know, that this is a danger for democracy. You know, populism is seen as something which should put into question the very basis of democracy is a danger. I'm not saying that there are not forms of populism which, of course, can lead to a more, you know, authoritarian regime. But what I'm insisting, and this is probably the center of my book, is that this is also open a possibility, because what is at stake in those resistances against post-democracy is a movement that want to recuperate voice, want to recuperate re-establish, recover popular sovereignty. But there, among those movements, populist movement, there are of course different ways in which those resistances can be articulated. This is what the difference between right-wing populism, which want, and I insist on that because the right-wing populists in a sense articulate demands which have a democratic kernel, because what those people say, we want to have a voice, you know. But they articulate that in a discourse which, of course, recover democracy in a way, but in order to restrict it. You know, for instance, the right-wing populists, yes, democracy, but for the good national, you know, and of course, immigrants, no. So it is a recuperation of democracy, but to restrict it. But there is also the possibility, and that is what we find in left populist movement, to recover democracy, but in order to deepen, to radicalize it. And this is where, you know, I think that the conjuncture is really crucial. Because what's going to happen, because I believe that this crisis of neoliberalism, this is something that cannot be overcome. And I agree, for instance, in the thesis defended by Wolfgang Streeck in his book, Buying Time, where he said, we are at a moment in which the possibility of the compromise between liberalism and democracy is finished. You know, it was possible under the Keynesian welfare state and of course you know that very well here in Sweden, to manage some kind of democratic capitalism. And they said, but no, it's not possible anymore. So we left really to choose between, you know, democracy or capitalism. By that, of course, he mainly criticized the neoliberal moment. You know. So we are at a crucial moment, and I think I'm afraid that many people on the left do not realize, you know, what is the possibility of this populist movement and the need to engage in it, because all those demands or those resistances can be articulated in many different ways. And of course, in order to understand that, you need to remember the thesis that we defended in Hegemony Socialist Strategy, what we call the anti-essentialism. Those demands do not have necessarily determined character. It's how they are going to be articulated that is going to make them being progressive or reactive. Here I think it's also interesting to make a comparison with what happened in the 30s, but not in the way in which it is usually done, because people are, you know, coming back to the Brown Plague and we are making something like the 30s. I think that's not the case. But there is a way in which there is a similarity, and it is something that we can understand when we remember what Karl Polanyi in his book The Great Transformation was saying. Polanyi in that book showed that in the 30s, we were seeing a movement against the consequences of what was the first globalization, you know, and the process of marketization of society that was linked to that. And he said that, he said, the society wanted to protect itself against this phenomenon. But those protection could lead to authoritarian, regressive regime, and of course this is the case of fascism, but it could also, and it has led in certain cases, to more redistributive, more progressive regime, and of course it was the case of the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt. And also a situation in which there are resistances to a process of globalization, but can go in different ways. We are exactly in a situation like that today. And this is what I think we need to be aware, that, you know, if the left does not understand the need to articulate those resistances in a project of radicalization of democracy, what's going to happen is that it's right-wing populism which is going to give, you know, a voice to those people, and that, of course, is going to link to a situation which is going to be, in fact, in the name of democracy, big regression for democracy. So that is, in a nutshell, you know, the main point of the book.
Thank you, Chantal. So, some years ago, you called for a return, for many years actually, you've called for a return of the left-right divide. This is basically the argument you're making now as well. Now you call for something which you call left populism. And for me that seems like a slight shift. What does that shift mean? And have you given up on making social democracy turn to the left? Is this a shift away from social democracy?
No, I don't think so. Because in fact, you know, what I call left populism, it could be understood as a radicalized form of social democracy. And I make reference to that in the book, I see that. Except, of course, that, look, we can't simply be coming back to, and when I say radical social democracy, and of course here in Sweden is also a particular case, you know, we tend, maybe certain people on the left have a very negative view of social democracy as reformist, as, you know, sold to capitalism. But social democracy was not always like that. There were at the beginning, for instance, more, for instance, I think that, and here I know something that I personally understand. Kautsky is by some leftists seen as somebody really, you know, right and terrible. Well, in fact, through a student of mine who wrote a thesis on Kautsky, I began to realize that there was much more to Kautsky than that, and that we on the more radical left were very unfair to Kautsky. Because they are, if you compare, you know, the project, the strategy of Kautsky with the one of, well, Social Democrat of today, which in fact I think we should not even call them Social Democrat because they are social liberals. You know, the moment when social democracy really capitulated to neoliberalism.
But why call this populism? I mean, why not say, let's return to social democracy? Why do you need a word that is so contested?
I'm just saying that I'm not saying we should return to social democracy. What I'm saying is that this left populism is not something that, you know, rejects social democracy. Well, look, here the problem is that when we speak of social democracy, what are we speaking about? I mean, if we are speaking, for instance, of Olof Palme or Kreisky in Austria, well, yeah, that's a form of social democracy which I think was really can be called social democracy, which is progressive. But, you know, François Hollande or Renzi in Italy, or that's also social democracy. So this is definitively something we need to be clear when we say, you know, that's a social democracy.
Or democratic socialism, like Bernie Sanders. That's the concept he uses in the US.
Okay, yes, democratic socialism. Yeah, but I mean, do you think that today Swedish Social Democrats are defending a project of democratic socialism? I mean, I'm not a specialist.
No, that's
Sweden,
the point, that they should return to that or something like that.
No. Let's clarify here. It's not a question of return.
They're not going to use the word populism either.
Okay. No, but I'm going to explain you why I want to speak of populism. Because, but let's see first the relation to social democracy. I think that there is a form of social democracy which is radical, you know, and that we should, and by the way, that was exactly what we were doing in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. And I became much more aware of that. We were not very clear about that, I must, but what we were proposing was a radicalization of social democracy. But it was a social democracy that existed at the time of the Keynesian welfare state. It was social democracy before its conversion to neoliberalism. But in the hegemony strategy, we were critical. We said, wait, it's not radical enough, this social democracy, because, for instance, it's too much centered on the economic demands of the workers, and it does not take account the demand of what was called at that moment the new social movement. You know, there was no, what about feminism, what about anti-racism, what about environmentalism, because it was already, no, it's become much bigger, but all at that moment there was also some, demand about the environment. So we were saying, but the social democracy does not, but the good one does not take account of those demands. So it needs to articulate the main thesis of hegemony. It's the need to articulate the demand of the working class with the demand of the new social movement. And this is why in the book we propose to redefine the socialist project in terms of radicalization of democracy. Understanding the socialism as the extension of democracy at the economic field, but we say, but that's very important, but it's not enough. Okay, so that was the thesis. We defined it into the book. I am still exactly. I mean, my.
But isn't that what social democracy even did in the 80s? Kind of. So you argued in the book for.
What they were doing?
So you the book argues for not seeing the working class as the central actor for social change anymore, as it was prioritized in Marxist thought. Yeah. For the benefit of new social movements, and that probably also had to do with post-industrial society, where social democracy no longer could have an electoral majority only through the industrial working class. So they needed to widen their voter base, and they created kind of an alliance.
No, they were not doing that at all. I mean, you are probably too young to have been
that's ageism.
Aware of ageism of reverse. Okay, well, why not? No, I tell you because I lived through that and I was active in the feminist movement, and we were, and of course I was already in Britain at that time, and we were feminists in contact with in the Labour Party, and it was a Labour Party that was certainly much more radical than what came with Blair, and I remember. Yeah, they say those feminist questions are important, but let's first build socialism, and then you'll see that this will solve the problem of women inequality. It's something they're going. By the way, they were all people much less sympathetic than those are petty bourgeois demands, So don't tell me that social democracy.
No, but the new social democracy of Clinton and of
but that's
Blair.
But that's worse. That's precisely the moment when social democrats capitulated to neoliberalism.
Yeah.
No, but my point here, Leonidas, is that even before their capitulation to neoliberalism, there were serious problems in terms of the strategy of the Social Democrats. And this is why I'm saying the point is not to come back to them. Let's say, there are something that it's important to come back to. For instance, the defense of the welfare state, okay? But not in the way in which it was put into practice, because, for instance, I'm absolutely convinced, and I've written about that the victory of Thatcher in Britain was made possible because of the bureaucratic and collectivist way in which many of the things of the welfare state were implemented. Because let's just take an example. You had, of course, an employment benefit, it was but you had to go to queue, and there were a lot of papers to write, to fill and things like that, and people feel oppressed, in a sense, by the state. The state was providing things which were important, but they feel oppressed. And Margaret Thatcher came and said, I'm going to give you freedom. You know, the state is necessarily oppressor. All those questions of state intervention, that's let's privatize. Okay, if the discourse of Thatcher could have resonances, it's because there was a problem with the way in which social democracy was implemented. So what I'm saying, of course, we've got to defend those gains of social democracy, but we've got to implement them in a way that is not, it's also, we need to take much more into account the question of democracy. But the question of populism is different. But here I just wanted to clarify why I think that, to reestablish the link with the good aspect of social democracy, for me it's important. But there have also been important changes, which are the consequence, of course, of neoliberalism, and particularly the fact that neoliberalism, what I think from the economic point of view, what is definitive is the primacy of financial capitalism. It's not the same mode of regulation of capitalism that we have to look. And consequence of that, we have seen that, and I think in a sense, let's say it's bad, but it offers a possibility. Many more sectors of the population now are submitted to the logic of capitalism.
Yes, but I think we should return to the concept of populism. Just
but this is what I'm going to do.
Yes.
This is precisely what I'm trying to explain to you.
One point I want to lift there is the aspect of, so why use the term populism? Yeah, you in the book you write about the need for...
Andreas, I was just going to explain that.
But I would like us to speak about the point of the opponent, the need for an opponent. Isn't that a dangerous idea?
Okay. But that's two different things, okay? All right, but let's try to clarify that. First, why? Because, well, what you are putting in question is the need for what I call a frontier, okay? Because politics, according to the conception that I follow, is always partisan. If there is politics, it's because there is conflict, there is antagonism. And this, of course, is not the view that everybody accepts. In fact, if we take off what is the political, we've got two different views. One which is called the associative view, the political, which is the political is acting in common, is the field where we can establish a consensus, field of liberty, but it's the one which is dominant in many, basically liberal thought. And then there is another conception which is called the dissociative conception of the political, who say that, as I was just expliciting, but if there is politics, because there is conflict, society is divided. It's a conception that we can, genealogy goes from Thucydides to Machiavelli, Max Weber, Carl Schmitt, of course, and today, for instance, in France, when people like Claude Leflore or Jacques Rancière belongs to that conception. But you see, it's very different. And of course, what it means, if you follow the dissociative view, which is of course what I do, is that politics is always concerned with the creation of us, and that necessitated the creation of a them. This is what it means that politics is about conflict and is partisan. So the question is, in politics require a frontier between the us and the them. Okay, this frontier can be constructed in different ways. Well, of course, liberalism, there is no frontier. This is precisely what is the view of consensus, which is Tony Blair, for instance, what we used to say. No, we are all middle class, we should all agree. In fact, basically is elimination of the political. So we need a frontier. This frontier, usually, I mean, when it was constructed, when there was a frontier, it was constructed like in Marxism on the basis of the capital, labor. proletariat bourgeoisie. This is how, in a sense, sometimes the left-right distinction was understood. And of course, with populism, what I'm putting in question is that this should not be today the way to construct a frontier. We need a frontier, but a frontier constructed in a transversal way, because it's not simply capital and labor. And this is what I was beginning to explain. There is today, because of the current form of capitalism,
use the word oligarchy, right?
Post-Fordism means that today, I mean, in a sense, you know, we are all affected today by the effect of this neoliberalism. Before, it was only as far as you were working in a factory. You know, that moment, the period of Fordism, it makes sense to say that there is a group of people. But today, I mean, it's not only the people, workers, which by the way is becoming, smaller and smaller. There are many more sectors of the population, and I would argue, in a sense, we are all affected by the capitalist logic. So, and this is why I was saying it's got a bad aspect, but a good one. Bad aspect in the sense that we are, constituencies suffering from capitalism is bigger, but it also means that the potentiality of creating an anti-capitalist movement are bigger, because now we can, and this is why I'm proposing to construct the frontier in a populist way, meaning by that the people from below, people from above. It's not only the working class, there are many groups who can participate in this collective will. And of course, this collective will obviously need to have a dam, because there is no way to construct a dam without a dam. Briefly, I could say, because I know some people are shocked by that, but here I'm following Saussure, and this idea that identities are always relational. You can't have, in order to have us, you need to have a dam.
And you've also argued for, you criticize liberalism as well as the left for not taking account of the emotional side of politics in your earlier books. Yeah. So, I mean...
That's another question, and if you want I can develop that.
It's not a question yet. It's not yet a question.
No, but well, if you want, I can touch that, because it's something I'm very passionate.
I mean, look at this crowd. Do you really want to waken their passionate side? Isn't that dangerous? Look at them. I mean, it's...
They don't seem to be dangerous to me.
That's a dangerous side of populism, right? The waking people's irrationality. Isn't that the problem also of Trump?
Don't say those platitudes which are exactly...
I don't think them, I just ask a question.
Okay, the media is pretending those things, but precisely we need to abandon. I mean, if we are going to speak seriously, we need to leave aside this kind of view of populism as being, demagogy.
Why do you need to take account of the emotional side of politics?
No, but wait a second, I think that of course you need to take account of that. But if you allow me to finish the first argument, I'm very systematic in my
yes, yeah.
Okay. Okay, we have accepted the fact that the frontier cannot be established strictly in terms of, capital and labor. That many more groups can be brought together in the construction of a collective will. This collective will, this us, require them. The them, of course, in this case, is going to be, well, I propose the term, the oligarchy. Well, basically, it's all the forces of financial capitalism, obviously, pension fund and all those hedge funds and all those things which constitute another point of the capital. Well, neoliberalism under its face of financial capital. some people, and for instance, Podemos in Spain, they use the term la casta, the caste, you know, or some people say the elites. I think it's not good because, in fact, people of Podemos themselves told me that was a mistake, because when as soon as we enter into government, people will begin to say, but you are so part of la casta, you know. And the elites is, okay, which kind of elites? You know, the cultural elites, are they the enemy? Or I think the elite is too vague. This is why I prefer the term oligarchy, because the people who are in charge, or the people who are at the basis of the financial capital. Plus, of course, also, there are essays of people who support that. You know, by the way, it's something which I don't agree with, and often people, the populist construction of frontiers say, the 99% against the 1%. No, I don't agree with that. Unfortunately, is much more complicated.
You speak about the people, right? That's the category you use.
Yeah, but the people is never 99% and against 1%. What is called sometimes the blanc, the French speak of the bourgeois, the bourgeois bloc. You know, it's also the people who are the allies, and really the people who profit a lot and who made possible the hegemony of the oligarchy. So this is why it's never so simple, 99 versus 1%. Okay, so we've now established why I speak of populism, because the question is to establish, construct a people. Now let's come to the question of emotion. Well, in the construction of the us of the people, the affective dimension is crucial, because, you know, for me, what is at stake in the construction of the people is the mobilization of common affects, some kind of way in which people are going to identify this us. People need to feel that they are part of this us. And this is not something that you are only doing on the basis of statistics, argument. There is an affective dimension on that. And unfortunately, I think that right-wing populism is understood that much better on the left, because they mobilize. I speak of passion in my work, and people have often asked me, why don't you use the term emotion? And I say, no, it's not the same thing, because emotion are something very individual. You know, it's by passion I refer to a certain type of emotion, and this is what I call common affects, the affects which are at stake in the construction of a popular identity. And I think that in constructing a people, the affective dimension is very important, and the left should abandon this rationalist idea that the left only uses arguments. You know, that every use of passion is something that only the right does. And here I want to answer straight away a possible critique, because so, you know, you privilege emotion, passion to reason. And I would say no, of course, you know, it's not that let's only mobilize, because, for instance, the construction of this popular will, collective will, is going to be based on the identification with a political project, you know, with the defense, recovering of popular sovereignty, of equality. So there is necessarily link between, you know, the affective dimension and some form of discursive inscription. And so it's not saying, oh no, pure emotion, no. And here I think this work I'm doing at the moment, referring to Spinoza. Spinoza speak in French, they translated the idée affectante. So ideas that affect. And I think that is very important to understand that, you know, affects are
So let's
always
move to a
linked by
concrete example of trying to create this identification with the movement. Parts of the left in Europe, for example, Sarah Wagenknecht in the German Left Party and Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, have both attempted a nationalist aspect of the left movement, and his party is called, it has France in the name, and you know, they sing the Marseillaise, and Sarah Wagenknecht has argued against the free movement within the European Union. So in Sweden that's a controversial topic, like how nationalist could the left be in order to connect to the affects of ordinary people while maintaining an anti-racist politics?
Well, that's a criticism which is often raised against left populism. Well, first I would say that, let's take the case of Podemos in Spain. You don't have at all this dimension.
But they don't have immigration in the same way as the rich northern. It's more of a topic probably in Northern Europe.
That's true. But and second, I must say that I think that the way Sarah Wagenknecht has been vilified is I'm not wanting to defend necessarily all she said, but I think that it has been presented, at least in France, I don't know, here is in gauche anti-immigration, left against immigration. If you read, and by the way, at least, thanks God, Libération, which is, if there is one left newspaper in France, it's Libération, and the honesty, you know, that when they began to criticize Wagenknecht for that, to publish exactly the position of Wagenknecht, to show that she never say you got anti-immigration. She, and for instance, she recognized many forms in which asylum, and then she just is saying that she's criticizing the idea of no borders. She said we need to have, and this is the same position that Jean-Luc Mélenchon has. She said we need to, you know, have some form of regulation of immigration, because they are saying no border. For instance, there was in France, because this woman is talking among some of the French left, they published a manifest for immigration, when they were saying stupid things like the following: we live in a world in which capital and merchandise can travel freely, so we should have the same for the workforce, and people should. Well, that is exactly the dream of neoliberalism, a world in which, you know, capital and people travel without frontiers. But, I mean, where are those? Are we going to have citizens which got some right to get our citizenship? I think it's really paradoxical to see that the left, which presents itself the most radical, are exactly defending the project of neoliberalism. So this is why I personally am not no border. And I think that not saying that you need to have some form of regulation. Of course, there is, I agree that there can be, you know, from very restrictive, but to criticize Mélenchon or Wagenknecht simply because of the fact, I mean, here I'm less sure about Wagenknecht because I don't know that word, but in the case of Mélenchon, Mélenchon is certainly not anti-immigration. And in fact, the people from La France Insoumise are really the one who act more, for instance, in Calais and in places where they've got immigrants, to respect the second aspect, for instance. It's true that La France Insoumise also I insist, because it's not that they've replaced l'Internationale by la Marseillaise. In fact, I was participating at least in two demonstrations in which they were singing both l'Internationale and la Marseillaise. But also, for instance, I believe that if you want to have political project, you know, that really can resonate with the people. You need to acknowledge what the signifier nation means. And here I will refer to Freud, who was insisting on what he called the libidinal investment, which was at stake in national form of identification. I think we need to acknowledge that. We can't just say, you know, this, you know, like Habermas, let's abandon, you know, identities and post-conventional identities. So we need to, this is a very important affect, but it's an affect that can be mobilized in different ways. And for instance, I do believe in the possibility, and I defend the idea of what I call a left-wing patriotism. You know, I think that...
But what about the idea of human rights? That you have the right, if you escape, if you don't have a home, you have the right to move somewhere else and find a new home. Isn't that a universal human right which should trump the sense of national belonging of certain...
But so you are, it means that you are against frontier. You don't think if people say that you've got, everybody's got the right to go everywhere and to come and install...
Yeah, I mean,
so
just because the neoliberals think it doesn't mean that every aspect of it is wrong. That's still a...
Well, I'm sorry, but I think that definitively we need to acknowledge the fact that at the moment at least, I would say the most important, the exercise of democratic rights. It's mainly at the national level that it's possible to do it. And we can't just say, okay, well, forget about that. I think it's important. Yeah. It's really important.
What do you think of the latest movements that are arrived, like the Me Too movement in feminism, and, for example, Greta Thunberg's, maybe remember, it's a Swedish young 16-year-old girl who started this.
Greta Thunberg.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Oh, you know her.
But
you broke my Swedish heart.
I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm joking. How does that fit into the concept of populism?
Differently. Okay. Well, let's not mix everything. I think obviously, for instance, the feminist demand is absolutely crucial because when we speak of the creation of a collective will, that collective will be constructed through what we in hegemony call a chain of equivalence. So they are in society a series of democratic demands. Democratic demand that we find, for instance, in feminism, obviously, anti-racism, environmentalism. So this project needs to be the articulation of those demands. I think that, for instance, I don't see the Me Too movement as a social movement. I mean, this is something that, you know, not everything that appears at the moment is... I think that the important issues which are raised by Me Too, because I'm not saying that, are part of the demand of feminism. So I don't think that it's a question of saying we are going to articulate the Me Too movement with no. What is the question? Because Me Too, you know, is also is much too vague in that. But what, of course, we need to articulate is through feminism what is really important in the struggle of Me Too. And of course, in the case of Greta Thunberg and you know, environmentalism. This is something which is absolutely crucial for the articulation of this collective will. In fact, you know, I even go to the point, I've just written a piece on that the hegemonic signifier for the creation of a popular will should be a Green New Deal. And this is a piece which I've written in relation to what's happening in Britain and the program of Jeremy Corbyn. And I say that we think, because there is always, in the articulation of different demand. There's always at the moment one demand that becomes the symbol of the other. You know? And I think that today the question about the environment should be the important one. The project of society should be articulated around that, but in a way in which it does take account of other demands. And this is what I find so interesting and so, you know, I've got a lot of time in the Green New Deal, that it is a way to articulate the struggle against inequality, you know, and the question of the planet, because with respect to the environmental movement, I think that we must be aware that it can be articulated in different ways. So we should not be fantastic.
Wasn't the success of Greta Thunberg that she did not link her struggle to any other struggles? She kept, and she didn't make any proposals or demands.
But
she just said,
but I think
so she's not a populist, really, right?
Look, I mean, I don't think we should think in terms of name here, and of course it's not a populist, but I think that could become the problem, you know, the fact that, I mean, of course it must not hold, but I'm not going to say she should have done that, obviously not, but I think we must be aware that this awakening of society to the demand of environmentalism can be articulated in many different ways. And for instance, you can have a very authoritarian form of ecology. We say ecology is such that, you know, we can't leave it to the democracy. It needs to be implemented by authoritarian regime. There is a way, well, green capitalism, in which, you know, capitalism is going to see big opportunity for us to kind of so it's all the ecological movement in its own can be articulated in many different ways. And I think that the Green New Deal is precisely the way in which it should be articulated in the project of left populism, because it is the articulation of, you know, struggle of very different demands. So we'll see what's happening with the movement. In fact, it's a great opportunity, this movement, but it's all depend on how it's going to be articulated. Because if
you want to be articulated against the oligarchy, is that what you mean? Or?
Well, against financial capitalism.
Yeah.
I don't believe really that we can have an ecological project that will, you know, be meaningful if it does not put into question neoliberalism and financial capitalism. And this is what I find problematic in some green parties. The fact that, you know, many of them are not anti-capitalist, and many of them, in fact, are perfectly ready to make alliance with the right. For instance, in France, ecology, movement, I mean, is divided, but there is the leader, Jadot, has already, you know, made some kind of move with respect to the possibility of alliances with Macron. In Germany, I mean, there's perfectly possible to, it's not unthinkable to the coalition in the CDU and the Green. And what's going to happen today in Austria is also very interesting. In Austria, we've got an election today, not tomorrow. So
we're running out of time, so
tomorrow,
we have to...
Tomorrow, yeah, but just let me finish that. In which there is a strong possibility that a coalition government will be formed by alliance of course the right, the Parti Conservative, and the Green, you know. So the Green parties, I mean, we should not believe that the Green demands by themselves are necessarily very progressive. It all depends on the articulated. And by the way, just to finish, the right wing is very clever about that. Marine Le Pen in France is already jumped on this question of the ecological demand and insisted that, but local valid, but this is what we always have said at the Rassemblement National. So she can also take advantage of that, you know. So this is something that we really need to be conscious of.
Thank you so much for this. Let's give it